There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in through the side door, dressed in the quiet fabric of a Tuesday night, a shared blanket, the low hum of a refrigerator. You don't recognize their weight until much later, when you look back and see them not as moments, but as hinges upon which your entire world silently swung. For me, that hinge was the precise, immeasurable pressure of Alex's head resting on my shoulder, his breathing slowing to the deep, even cadence of sleep. It was a simple, physical fact, but in the silent architecture of my apartment, it felt like a tectonic shift, a realignment of every map I had ever drawn for myself. In that quiet, I felt the terrifying and beautiful truth of it all. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again, no matter how carefully you try to fit them back into their frames. It began, as most things between us did, with an unspoken need. Alex had a key to my apartment, a fact that seemed perfectly normal to everyone who knew us. We'd been best friends since our sophomore year of college, a decade of inside jokes, shared pizzas, and a kind of fraternal shorthand that baffled outsiders. He was the kinetic energy, the one who filled every room with his easy laugh and restless motion, a consultant whose life was a series of airports, client dinners, and crisp, sterile hotel rooms. I was his anchor, the quiet center of his spinning world. I was a photographer, a man who made his living by watching, by waiting for the light to be just right, for the fleeting expression that told the whole story. It was a profession that suited my nature, to observe, to document, to feel things deeply but rarely show the proof. Our friendship was a comfortable, well-worn thing, a fortress I had built around a secret I'd kept for almost as long as I'd known him. The secret was a quiet, persistent ache in my chest whenever he smiled a certain way, a low hum of longing that I had learned to file away like an old, overexposed negative, too precious to throw out, too flawed to ever develop. I loved him. It was a simple, immutable fact, a piece of my own internal geography as fundamental as the direction of north. But he was Alex. He was all bright, sunlit surfaces, a man who moved through the world with an assumption of its straightforwardness. He dated women, beautiful, smart, vivacious women who seemed to be cut from the same bright cloth as he was. There was never a question, never a hint of ambiguity. We were best friends, brothers, the staunchest, most unshakable platonic duo in our shared universe. And I was the loyal keeper of the boundary lines, the silent guardian of a status quo that both protected me and slowly, quietly, starved me. The hinge moment, that first night where the world tilted, was months after his breakup with Sarah. It wasn't a dramatic split, just the slow erosion of a long-distance relationship worn down by conflicting schedules and the tyranny of time zones. But it left Alex unmoored. He'd always been a creature of motion, but now his restlessness had a sharp, anxious edge. He started spending more nights at my place, using the spare key not for convenience, but for refuge. He'd show up late, smelling of recycled airplane air and exhaustion, dropping his laptop bag by the door with a heavy thud that seemed to carry the weight of his entire week. He never had to ask. The guest room was always ready, a silent offering, but he rarely used it. Instead, he would collapse onto the sofa, grab a corner of whatever throw blanket was nearby, and just be. That night, he had been quieter than usual. He'd tried to tell me about a difficult client in Chicago, his words tangling and losing their way until he just gave up, shaking his head and letting out a long, shuddering sigh. I had put on some ambient, instrumental music, a silent suggestion that words weren't necessary. We sat on opposite ends of my large, gray couch, a continent of cushions between us, watching the city lights flicker to life outside my big picture window. I was pretending to read a book on photographic theory, but I wasn't absorbing a single word. My entire consciousness was a finely tuned sensor, calibrated to the man sitting 6 feet away. I was aware of the way his shoulders slumped, the tension in his jaw, the rhythm of his fingers tapping restlessly on his thigh. He was a tightly wound coil of stress, and I felt a helpless, overwhelming urge to reach across the space and smooth out the lines of worry on his forehead. An urge I immediately, reflexively, suppressed. After an hour of this charged silence, he shifted. He stretched his long limbs, groaning softly, and then, without any preamble, he slid across the cushions until his side was flush against mine. My breath hitched. It was a small movement, but it felt like a continent drifting, a collision of tectonic plates. He was still careful, his posture a study in plausible deniability. He was just getting comfortable, stretching out, nothing more. But then he leaned his head back against the top of the sofa, his hair brushing against my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I was a statue carved from anxious stone. I could feel the warmth of him through my shirt, a low, steady heat that seemed to seep directly into my bones. I kept my eyes fixed on the page of my book, the letters blurring into meaningless black squiggles. "Long day," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," I managed to reply, my own voice sounding thin and distant. He was quiet for another minute, and I thought that was it. The new boundary. Close, but not touching. I could live with that. I could recalibrate. But then, his head tilted. It was a slow, deliberate surrender. It dipped sideways until the full weight of it came to rest in the space between my neck and my shoulder. And there it stayed. The world stopped. The music faded. The city lights dissolved. My entire universe contracted to that single point of contact. The soft crush of his hair against my skin. The astonishing, solid weight of his trust, or his exhaustion, or whatever it was. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs, and I was terrified he would feel its frantic rhythm. I held my breath, waiting for him to pull away, to realize what he'd done and retreat back to his side of the couch with a nervous laugh. But he didn't. Instead, he let out a soft sigh, a sound of such profound release that it vibrated through my entire chest. He shifted slightly, nestling in, making himself more comfortable against me. His breathing, which had been shallow and tight, began to deepen. It slowed, evening out into the long, peaceful waves of genuine sleep. And I just sat there, frozen in place, a living piece of furniture. My book lay forgotten in my lap. My own muscles ached with the strain of holding perfectly still, terrified that the slightest movement would break the spell. This was a place I had never been before, a territory so far beyond the established maps of our friendship that I had no idea what the rules were. Was I allowed to breathe? Was I allowed to move my arm, which was starting to go numb? Was I supposed to pretend this was normal? I spent what felt like hours like that, trapped in a state of exquisite torture and breathtaking bliss. I studied the way a stray lock of his dark hair fell across his forehead. I listened to the almost imperceptible whistle of his breath on the exhale. I felt the slow rise and fall of his chest, a rhythm that my own body seemed to instinctively want to match. This was the secret, I thought. This was the image I'd kept locked away in the darkroom of my own mind, the one I never dared to bring into the light. Him, here, with me. Not as a brother, not as a friend, but as something closer, something quieter. Something that rested its head on your shoulder and fell asleep, trusting you to hold the world at bay. It was everything I had ever wanted, and it was happening under the guise of something it wasn't. He was just tired. He was just my friend. He didn't mean anything by it. The plausible deniability was a shield for him, but it was a razor's edge for me, separating a dream from a potential misunderstanding that could shatter everything. I didn't move a muscle. I just let him sleep, and in the deep, profound silence of my apartment, I felt my world, which had been so carefully ordered, begin to come apart at the seams. To understand the magnitude of that single, simple gesture, you have to understand the architecture of the friendship that preceded it. Alex and I met in a crowded, overheated university dormitory hallway. I was trying to wrestle a ridiculously oversized box of books through my doorway, and he, walking past with the easy, athletic grace he always possessed, simply stopped, grabbed one end without a word, and helped me maneuver it inside. He was wearing a faded t-shirt for a band I loved, and had a smile that seemed to generate its own light. He introduced himself, saw my camera equipment spread out on my desk, and immediately launched into a dozen questions about f-stops and focal lengths, a subject he knew nothing about, but approached with the boundless curiosity he applied to everything. Within an hour, it felt like I'd known him for years. He was my opposite in almost every way. Where I was reserved, he was effusive. Where I processed the world internally, he processed it out loud, talking through his thoughts, his feelings, his plans in a constant, flowing stream of consciousness. I was the audience for his life's monologue, and I found, to my surprise, that I was a rapt one. He drew me out of the quiet shell I had built for myself. He dragged me to parties, introduced me to his ever-expanding circle of friends, and insisted I was more interesting than I gave myself credit for. He saw a version of me that I didn't know existed, and his belief in that version was so absolute that I started to believe in it, too. Our bond solidified over late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee, disastrous attempts at cooking in our shared dorm kitchen, and long, rambling conversations that lasted until dawn. We talked about everything and nothing, our dreams of the future, our fears of failure, the ridiculousness of our professors. He was the only person I ever showed my most personal photographs to, the ones that weren't for a class or a client, but were just for me. He would look at them with a serious, focused intensity, his usual boisterous energy subdued. He'd point to a shadow, a line, a captured glance, and say, "That's it. That's the thing you see that nobody else does." He understood my language, even if he couldn't speak it himself. The love I felt for him grew so gradually, so organically, that I barely noticed it happening. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was more like the slow, patient process of erosion, water shaping stone. One day, he was my best friend. The next, the thought of him being with someone else sent a sharp, painful pang through my chest. It happened during our junior year. He started dating Sarah, a bright, cheerful girl from his political science class. She was lovely. She was kind. She laughed at all his jokes. And watching them together felt like looking at a photograph that was perfectly composed, perfectly lit, and completely, utterly wrong. That was when I built the walls. I learned to school my features into a mask of benign, brotherly affection. I became an expert in redirection, deftly steering conversations away from any topic that veered too close to the raw, vulnerable territory of my own heart. I celebrated his happiness with Sarah. I gave him advice. I listened to him talk about her for hours, my own feelings locked away in a soundproof room deep inside me. It was a masterclass in self-effacement. I convinced myself it was a noble sacrifice, the price of keeping him in my life. Losing him as a friend was a possibility so catastrophic, so unthinkable, that any amount of personal pain was preferable. So I settled into my role. The supportive best friend, the platonic confidant, the keeper of secrets, all of them his, none of them mine. Over the years, our lives diverged and converged. He went into the fast-paced world of tech consulting, and I slowly, painstakingly, built a career out of my art. But our friendship remained the one constant. My apartment became his home base, the only place he seemed to truly relax. When he and Sarah were on the rocks, he'd talk to me about it, his frustration and sadness a palpable force in the room. I'd listen, offering neutral, careful advice, all while a treacherous, hopeful part of me felt a flicker of something ugly and selfish. When they finally broke up, he was devastated, but also, I sensed, relieved. It was the end of something that had stopped fitting long ago. "I just feel empty," he told me one night, a few weeks after the official end. He was staring into a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid as if it held some kind of answer. "Like I'm just going through the motions. Get on a plane, impress a client, write a report, get on another plane. What's the point?" "The point is you're building a career," I'd said, the words feeling hollow even as I spoke them. "You're successful." He looked up at me, his eyes clouded with a weariness that went bone deep. "But am I happy, Leo? Are you?" The question caught me so off guard that I had no ready-made deflection. I just stared at him, the silence stretching between us. He was asking about me. In the midst of his own quiet crisis, he had turned the lens around. It was such a rare, direct inquiry into my own state of being that it left me momentarily speechless. I was happy enough, I told myself. I had my work. I had my solitude. I had him. But his question hung in the air, an uncomfortable truth I didn't want to examine. Was I happy? Or was I just waiting? My life felt like a photograph I was perpetually composing but never taking, always waiting for one crucial element to enter the frame. That conversation felt like the first tremor before the earthquake. It was a crack in the smooth facade of our friendship, a hint that the foundation was not as stable as I had believed. He was searching for something, a sense of grounding that his life of constant motion couldn't provide. And he had started, unconsciously, to look for it in me. The late-night arrivals became more frequent. The silences between us grew longer, but they were no longer empty. They were filled with a kind of unspoken gravity, a sense of two celestial bodies slowly, inexorably, being pulled into the same orbit. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself it was just the aftermath of his breakup, a temporary need for comfort that he would find in his best friend, regardless of who that friend was. I was a port in a storm, nothing more. And I kept telling myself that, right up until the night his head landed on my shoulder, and all my carefully constructed theories crumbled into dust. The shift was subtle at first, a change in atmospheric pressure that you feel in your bones before the storm arrives. After Sarah, Alex's world, which had always seemed so defined and goal-oriented, became a landscape of questions. His work, once a source of pride and purpose, now seemed to be a relentless treadmill. He spoke of his achievements with a strange detachment, as if describing the life of a stranger. The bright, confident energy that had always been his hallmark began to flicker, revealing glimpses of a profound exhaustion underneath. He was like a magnificent ship that had been sailing at full speed for years, only to find itself suddenly becalmed in a vast, empty ocean, its sails slack, its destination forgotten. His loneliness was a physical presence. It entered my apartment with him, a cold draft that clung to his coat. He'd try to shake it off, launching into an animated story about a ridiculous client or a travel mishap, but the performance would inevitably run out of steam. His voice would trail off, his smile would fade, and he'd be left staring at the wall, his gaze distant and haunted. It was in these moments that the dynamic between us began to change. I had always been the quiet one, the listener. But now, my silence became less a passive receptacle for his words and more an active, comforting presence. It was a space where he didn't have to perform. He didn't have to be the charming consultant or the fun-loving friend. He could just be tired. He could just be sad. My apartment became his sanctuary. He'd let himself in, often while I was in my dark room, and I'd emerge to find him asleep on the couch, his laptop open beside him, a half-finished email on the screen. He looked younger when he slept, the lines of stress around his eyes smoothed away, his face unguarded and vulnerable. The first few times it happened, I felt a jolt of alarm, a sense of trespass. It was too intimate, but he seemed so utterly depleted, so in need of rest, that I couldn't bring myself to wake him. I would just pull a blanket over him, turn down the lights, and retreat to my own room, my heart pounding with a confusing mix of tenderness and anxiety. The pretext was always work. My flight got in late, and I have an early call. Mind if I just crash on your couch? It's closer than my place, or I need to finish this presentation and my internet is acting up. Can I work from your place for a bit? The excuses were always plausible, always reasonable. They were the scaffolding that allowed this new structure to be built without either of us having to acknowledge the design. He needed a place to land, and I was the safest harbor he knew. It was the logic of our friendship, stretched to a new, unprecedented shape. But it was more than just a place to sleep. He began to seek a different kind of comfort, a proximity that tiptoed right up to the line of our platonic bond. We'd watch movies, a ritual we'd had for years, but now the space between us on the couch would shrink over the course of the film. A foot would brush against mine. A hand, reaching for the popcorn bowl, would linger for a second too long near my own. These were micro-movements, easily dismissed as accidental, but they were happening with a new, undeniable frequency. I became a forensic analyst of touch, replaying each instance in my mind, searching for intent, for meaning. Was it a conscious act? Or was it just the unconscious gravitation of a lonely person towards the nearest source of warmth? I was terrified of misinterpreting the signals, of projecting my own desperate hope onto his casual gestures. To see what I wanted to see would be a catastrophic error. It would be like mistaking a light leak in the darkroom for a divine message in the print. A flaw, not a feature. So I remained perfectly still, a passive observer in my own life. I did not initiate. I did not reciprocate. I simply allowed. I allowed his foot to rest against mine. I allowed his shoulder to brush my arm. I became a fixed point, a constant, letting him be the one to navigate the space between us. My inaction felt like a form of self-preservation. If I did nothing, I could not be blamed for the outcome. If he was the one closing the distance, then the responsibility and the meaning was his alone. It was a coward's logic, but it was the only thing that kept my terror at bay. The true catalyst, the event that led directly to that first night of him sleeping on my shoulder, was a particularly brutal week he'd had in Seattle. He'd been tasked with overseeing a massive software integration for a company on the verge of collapse. He was working 18-hour days, living on stale coffee and adrenaline, caught between an incompetent client and his own demanding bosses. He called me every night, his voice frayed and thin. He didn't talk about the technical details. He talked about the exhaustion, the feeling of being completely and utterly alone in a city where he knew no one. "I just want to come home," he'd whispered into the phone on the last night, the sound so raw and vulnerable it felt like a physical blow. He didn't say, "Go home." He said, "Come home," to my apartment. To me. When he finally arrived back in town, he came straight to my place. He looked like a ghost. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he seemed to have lost weight. He dropped his bags, walked past me without a word, and collapsed onto the couch. That was the night. The night he slid across the cushions. The night he laid his head on my shoulder. It wasn't a choice born of romance or desire, not on his end. It was born of pure, unadulterated exhaustion and a deep, instinctual need for a safe place to fall apart. He wasn't reaching for a lover. He was reaching for his anchor. But as I sat there, holding my breath, feeling the weight of him against me, the distinction between those two roles began to dissolve, leaving me adrift in a new, beautiful, and terrifying reality. And so the ritual began. It wasn't spoken of, it wasn't planned, but it became the new shape of our evenings. It was a silent agreement forged in exhaustion and loneliness. After that first night, the pretense of the separate cushions on the couch was abandoned. Whenever Alex was over, which was now most nights, the evening would end the same way. We'd be talking or watching a movie, and at some point, a quiet gravity would take over. He would lean into my space, and I would let him. His head would find its now familiar place on my shoulder, and his breathing would slow into the rhythm of sleep. Each time it happened, my internal world lit up like a switchboard. The first phase was always a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic. My body would tense, my breath would catch. "This is it," a voice in my head would scream. "This is the time he'll realize what he's doing, what it could mean, and he'll pull away forever." I would brace myself for the recoil, for the awkward laugh and the hasty retreat to the other end of the couch, a retreat that would signal the end of this fragile new intimacy. But it never came. He would only settle in deeper, a soft sigh escaping his lips as he surrendered to sleep, and the panic in my chest would slowly, gradually, subside. The panic would then give way to a state of hyper-awareness. I became a connoisseur of minutiae. I could distinguish the scent of his shampoo from the faint, clean smell of his skin. I learned the exact weight and texture of his hair, how it felt against my neck. I could feel the subtle vibrations of his dreams, the occasional twitch of a finger or a muffled word spoken in sleep. My apartment, usually a backdrop, became an active participant. The soft glow of the lamp in the corner seemed to wrap us in a private bubble of light. The low hum of the city outside became a distant, protective barrier. My senses were turned up to their highest possible setting, absorbing every detail of his proximity, cataloging it, committing it to memory as if I were a dying man trying to memorize the face of his beloved. This hyper-awareness was both a paradise and a torment. It was a privilege to be this close to him, to be the keeper of his unguarded moments. It felt like being allowed into a secret, sacred space. I was seeing the version of Alex that no one else did. Not the confident consultant, not the charming friend, but the tired man who needed a place to rest his head. It was an intimacy so profound it made my heart ache. But it was an intimacy built on a foundation of ambiguity, and that was the torment. I was a character in a scene, but I didn't have the script. Was I his pillow? Or was I his person? The space between those two interpretations was a chasm, and I was perpetually suspended over it. I began to think of it in terms of my photography. Developing a print in the darkroom is a process of patience and faith. You place the exposed paper in the chemical bath, and for a long moment, nothing happens. The paper is just a blank, white sheet. You have to trust that an image is there, latent, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. You watch, you wait, and then, slowly, ghostly shapes begin to appear. A shadow deepens here, a highlight emerges there. The image resolves itself gradually, coming into focus out of the ether. That's what these nights felt like. Each time he fell asleep on me, it was like another minute in the developer bath. A latent image of what we could be was slowly, tantalizingly, beginning to emerge. But I was terrified of pulling it out too soon, of exposing it to the light before it was ready, only to find the image was faint, distorted, or not what I had hoped for at all. The ritual evolved. At first, it was just his head on my shoulder. Then, one night, as he drifted off, his arm, which had been resting between us, draped itself loosely across my stomach. It was a dead weight, an unconscious placement. But my stomach clenched, and a jolt of heat shot through me. I stared down at his hand, resting just above my hip. His fingers were long and graceful, a stark contrast to the restless energy they usually possessed. Now they were still, curled slightly in sleep. I had the most overwhelming urge to cover his hand with my own, to lace our fingers together. The desire was so powerful it felt like a physical force, a magnetic pull. But I resisted. I kept my hands clenched in my lap, my knuckles white. I would not be the one to define this. I would wait for the image to resolve on its own. Another night, he shifted in his sleep and ended up with his head in my lap. He was curled on his side, his face turned towards my stomach, his arms still thrown across me. He looked like a child seeking comfort. I was completely trapped, pinned to the couch by the man I loved. My legs were going numb, but I didn't care. I looked down at the top of his head, at the whirl of his dark hair, and I felt a wave of tenderness so powerful it almost brought tears to my eyes. This was unbearable. This was unsustainable. How long could I sit here, acting as a piece of sentient furniture, while my heart was breaking and healing and breaking all over again in the space of a single hour? Our friends noticed the change, though they couldn't have understood its nature. You two are practically attached at the hip these days. A mutual friend, Chloe, had remarked one evening when Alex had begged off a group dinner to, in his words, just have a quiet night at Leo's. The comment hung in the air, and I saw a flicker of something, defensiveness? Confusion? In Alex's eyes before he laughed it off. Leo's got the comfortable couch, he'd said, clapping me on the back. It was the perfect deflection, the armor of plausible deniability. I had the comfortable couch. I was the convenient location. I was the path of least resistance. He was an expert at creating these narratives, these simple, logical explanations that kept the world, and perhaps himself, from looking too closely at what was really happening. But I was looking. I was looking so closely that I felt I was going insane. The ritual became the central focus of my life. My own work began to suffer. I'd be in my darkroom, trying to focus on a print, and my mind would drift back to the feeling of his weight against me. I'd be out on a shoot, trying to capture the soul of a landscape, and all I could think about was the geography of his sleeping form. He had colonized my thoughts, my senses, my entire being. And the worst part was, I had no idea if he was even aware of the occupation. One evening, the ritual took another turn. He arrived looking more haggard than ever, having just come from a tense meeting where his project's budget had been slashed. He didn't even bother with the pretense of conversation. He just dropped his bag, toed off his shoes, and lay down on the couch, pulling a throw blanket over himself. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. I sat down in the armchair nearby, giving him space. After a few minutes of heavy silence, he spoke, his voice quiet and rough. "I'm so tired, Leo, I know," I said softly. He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "Will you just sit with me?" It wasn't a request for me to stay in the room. It was a request for me to come to the couch. It was the first time he had ever verbally acknowledged his need for my proximity. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and walked the few feet to the sofa. I hesitated for a second, unsure of the protocol. Where was I supposed to sit? He solved the dilemma for me. He shifted over, making a space, and patted the cushion right beside his hip. I sat down, my back against the arm of the couch, my legs stretched out alongside his. We were parallel, side by side, close but not touching. He turned his head on the cushion to look at me, his eyes dark with a weariness that seemed bottomless. "Thanks," he whispered. He closed his eyes, and within minutes, he was asleep. But this time was different. He hadn't fallen asleep on me. He had asked me to be near him while he fell asleep. The distinction was subtle, but to me, it was monumental. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate act of seeking comfort. The latent image in the developer fluid suddenly sharpened, a clear line emerging where before there had only been a blur. He wasn't just falling. He was reaching, and I was the one he was reaching for. I sat there for hours, not moving, just watching him sleep, and for the first time, a dangerous, fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in my chest. This ritual, this strange, silent dance of ours, wasn't just about his need. It was about us. And I had no idea where it was leading, but I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I was going to follow it to its end. The crossing happened on a rainy Tuesday in November. The city was wrapped in a thick, gray mist, and the sound of the rain against my windows was a constant, soothing rhythm. It was the kind of night that felt like a self-contained world, sealed off from everything else. Alex had been at my place since late afternoon. He'd had a project canceled at the last minute, leaving him with a rare, unstructured week, and he seemed completely at a loss with what to do with the sudden emptiness. He had drifted around my apartment all day, restless and quiet, picking up photography books and putting them down without reading them, staring out the window for long stretches. He was like a ship whose rudder had broken, turning in slow, aimless circles. By evening, a comfortable quiet had settled over us. We ordered Thai food, ate it sitting on the floor in front of my coffee table, and then migrated to the couch. The ritual began without a single word. He took his usual spot, and I took mine, knowing it was only a matter of time. We put on a movie, some black and white classic I'd been wanting to see, but neither of us was really watching. The screen was just a flickering centerpiece for the silence between us. About halfway through, he did it. He leaned over, slowly, deliberately, and rested his head in my lap. This time, it felt different. There was an intention to it that hadn't been there before. He wasn't drifting off to sleep. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the television. His body was tense, not relaxed. I rested my hand on his back, a gesture that had become part of the ritual, my attempt to offer comfort. But instead of relaxing under my touch, he seemed to grow even more still. I could feel the tension humming through him, a low-frequency vibration of anxiety. I started to gently rub his back, making slow, circular motions between his shoulder blades, hoping to soothe whatever was troubling him. He let out a shaky breath, and I felt him press his face a little deeper into my thigh. The rain drummed against the glass. The film score swelled and faded. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm, a bass drum marking time in the quiet room. We stayed like that for a long, long time. The movie ended, the credits rolled, and the screen went black, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the distant, diffuse glow of the city. I thought he had finally fallen asleep. His breathing was even, his body still. I was about to try and extricate myself, to somehow maneuver him into a more comfortable position so I could go to bed. When he spoke, his voice was a low, rough whisper, barely audible over the rain. "Leo." "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice thick from disuse. He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel a tremor run through him. I kept my hand on his back, a steady point of contact in the darkness. "Don't go," he said. The words were a plea. Not "don't go to bed," but "don't leave me." My chest tightened. "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, my voice barely a murmur. He shifted then, pushing himself up on one elbow. He turned to face me, his body now angled towards mine on the couch. In the dim light, I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes wide and dark and full of something I couldn't read. It looked like fear. It looked like hope. It looked like the split second before a lightning strike. The space between us was electric, charged with 10 years of unspoken words, 1,000 nights of quiet longing. The air was so thick I felt like I couldn't draw a proper breath. My hand was still on his back, and his was resting on my leg, his fingers gripping my jeans. He was so close. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. My mind was a deafening roar of panic and want. This was it. The moment the photograph fully develops. The moment of truth. And I was utterly, completely terrified. I was sure I had misread everything. That this was about to become the most profound and friendship-shattering misunderstanding of my life. He didn't move. He just looked at me, his gaze searching my face in the dark, as if trying to find an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. And in his eyes, I saw my own fear reflected back at me. He was just as terrified as I was. He was standing on the same precipice. And that, more than anything, gave me the courage to stay absolutely still, to not break the spell, to let the moment unfold as it was meant to. Then, he spoke again, and his voice was so fragile, so full of a terrifying vulnerability I had never heard from him before, that it shattered my heart. "Would it be okay?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew exactly what he was asking. Would it be okay if I crossed this line? Would it be okay if I change everything, forever? Would it be okay if I risked this perfect, safe friendship for a possibility that might destroy us both? I couldn't find my voice. The words were trapped in my throat, a knot of emotion so tight I couldn't speak. So I just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement in the darkness. But he saw it. He took a breath, a shaky, uncertain thing, and then he leaned in. It was the slowest, most hesitant movement I have ever witnessed. It was not a kiss of passion or of confident desire. It was a question. It was a confession. It was a surrender. His lips met mine, and they were soft and hesitant and a little cold from the chill in the room. It lasted for only a second. A feather-light touch. A ghost of a kiss. And then he pulled back, just an inch, his eyes still closed, his forehead now resting against mine. The silence that followed was more profound than any we had ever shared. It was not empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of a boundary being irrevocably, undeniably, crossed. The world had tilted on its axis, and the hinge I had felt months ago had finally, fully, swung the door wide open. In the darkness of my living room, with the rain still falling outside, everything had changed. He had kissed me, and I had let him. The image was finally in the light, and it was sharper, clearer, and more terrifyingly beautiful than I had ever dared to imagine. We just stayed there, breathing the same air, our foreheads pressed together, two people stranded on the far side of a line they had just crossed together, with no map to show them where to go from here. The aftermath was not a flood, but a slow, creeping tide of silence and retreat. The moment after the kiss was fragile, a delicate bubble of shared vulnerability. We eventually separated, the space between us on the couch feeling like a vast, empty canyon. There were no words. What could we possibly say? He stood up, looking lost and disoriented, and mumbled something about being tired. He didn't look at me. He just turned and walked into the guest room, the room he hadn't used in months, and quietly closed the door behind him. The sound of that click was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a statement, a boundary being re-erected, hastily and clumsily. I sat on the couch for hours, long after the rain had stopped, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. The hesitant question in his eyes, the soft, tentative pressure of his lips, the terrifying, beautiful silence. It had felt so real, so significant. But the closed door was a stark, brutal contradiction. It was a full stop at the end of a sentence that had just begun. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up. There was a note on the kitchen counter, written on a torn piece of paper towel in his familiar, messy scrawl. Had an early start. See you later. There was no mention of the night before. It was a clean, surgical excision of the moment from our shared history. It was as if it had never happened. And then, the avoidance began. It was subtle at first. My texts would get short, delayed replies. Swamped with work, he'd write. My calls went to voicemail. He was always in a meeting or on a plane. The excuses were plausible, just like before, but now they weren't scaffolding for intimacy. They were walls. The man who had used my apartment as a sanctuary was now actively avoiding it. The silence that had once been a comfort between us was now a weapon, a vast, echoing emptiness filled with my own anxieties. My hope, that fragile tendril that had begun to grow, withered and died. I was a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss wasn't a confession. It was a moment of confusion, of loneliness, a temporary aberration brought on by stress and emotional exhaustion. He had reached for comfort and had gone too far, and now he was horrified by what he'd done. He was straight. He had always been straight. And I, in my hopeful delusion, had let him cross a line that he was now desperately trying to uncross. The pain of this realization was a physical thing, a dull, constant ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was worse than the years of silent longing, because now I knew what I was missing. I had held it in my hands for a single, fleeting moment, and now it was gone. After a week of this agonizing radio silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I felt like one of my own photographs, left in the chemical fixer for too long, the image slowly degrading, turning to black. I needed to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, it was better than this corrosive ambiguity. I had spent a decade being the passive observer. It was time to act. I drove to his apartment. It was a sterile, modern place in a high-rise building, a place that had always felt more like a hotel suite than a home. It was the anti-Leo apartment. I stood outside his door for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs. What was I going to say? What if he didn't answer? What if he answered and looked at me with pity or disgust? I took a deep breath, clenched my fist, and knocked. The silence stretched on for so long I was convinced he wasn't home, or that he was inside, holding his breath, waiting for me to go away. I was about to turn and leave when I heard the sound of the deadbolt turning. The door opened a few inches. Alex stood there, looking even worse than he had the week before. He was wearing the same t-shirt and sweatpants he'd had on for days. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion and something else. Fear. He didn't open the door further. He just stood there, blocking the entrance. Leo. Hey, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Can I come in? He hesitated, his eyes darting away from mine. I'm kind of a mess. It's not a good time, I don't care, I said, my voice gaining an edge of desperation. Alex, we need to talk. That was the one thing he couldn't refuse. For all our years of unspoken truths, we had always, eventually, talked. He let out a long, defeated sigh and opened the door, stepping back to let me in. His apartment was dark, the blinds drawn against the afternoon sun. Clothes were strewn over a chair, and empty takeout containers were piled on his coffee table. It was the apartment of a man in hiding. I didn't sit down. I just stood in the middle of his living room, a stranger in a space I barely knew. He stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. What's going on? I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could. You disappear for a week. You don't answer my calls. What happened? He wouldn't look at me. He stared at a spot on the floor. I told you I've been busy. Work is crazy, don't. I said, my voice cracking. Please, don't do that. Don't lie to me. Not about this. That got through to him. He finally looked up, and his face was a mask of torment. I don't know what you want me to say, Leo. I want you to say the truth, I said, my voice rising, all my carefully managed composure crumbling. I want you to tell me what that kiss was. Was it a mistake? Were you just lonely? Were you drunk? Just tell me, so I can deal with it. This silence is killing me. He winced, as if my words were physical blows. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing a small, frantic circle in front of the door. It's not that simple. It feels pretty simple from where I'm standing. I shot back, the hurt making me cruel. You kissed me. You freaked out, and now you're hiding. That seems pretty straightforward. I didn't freak out, he said, his voice rising to match mine. Then what do you call this? I asked, gesturing around the dark, messy apartment. This is you freaking out. He stopped pacing and stood in front of me, his jaw tight, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and desperation. I'm not freaking out. I'm confused, okay? I'm so confused I feel like my head is going to explode, he finally said it. The truth. He sank down onto the arm of his sofa, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. I don't know what's happening to me, he said, his voice muffled by his hands. All I know is that for the last few months, the only place I've felt safe, the only place I've felt like I could breathe, is on your couch. And I didn't understand why. I just knew I needed to be there. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. And that night, it wasn't a mistake, Leo. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But the second I did it, it was like a dam broke. And everything I thought I knew about myself, about who I am, it all just got washed away. And it's terrifying. He was a man drowning. And in his panic, he had pushed away the only lifeboat he had. My anger evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. I walked over and sat down on the coffee table in front of him, so we were at eye level. What are you afraid of? I asked softly. Everything, he whispered. I'm afraid of what this means. I'm afraid of what people will think. I'm afraid of what you think. I'm afraid I've ruined the one good thing in my life. Our friendship. You think a kiss could ruin us? I asked, a sad smile touching my lips. Alex, I've been in love with you for 10 years. A kiss is not what's going to break us. The confession just slipped out. I hadn't planned to say it. But in that moment of raw, brutal honesty, it was the only truth that mattered. It hung in the air between us, a stark and undeniable fact. Alex just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The confusion in his eyes was slowly replaced by a look of dawning, staggering comprehension. He was looking back over the years, recontextualizing every shared glance, every late-night conversation, every moment of quiet support. He was seeing the latent image for the first time. 10 years, he breathed, the words full of awe and regret. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He reached out then, his hand trembling slightly, and cupped my cheek. His thumb gently stroked my skin. It was a gesture of such incredible tenderness it made my eyes well up. God, Leo, he whispered. I'm so sorry, don't be, I managed to say. I'm such an idiot, he said, a wet, broken laugh escaping his lips. It was right there. The whole time, it was right there in front of me, and I was too blind to see it. He shook his head, his eyes searching mine. I don't know what this is. I don't have a name for it. All I know is that I don't want to go back to the way things were before. I don't want to pretend that kiss didn't happen. I don't want to be in a world where I can't have that. Have you? He leaned in again, and this time, there was no hesitation. There was no fear. It was a kiss of dawning certainty, of relief, of coming home. It was the answer to a question I had been asking in silence for a decade. It was the end of the conflict and the beginning of everything else. The resolution did not come in a flash of lightning, but in the quiet, steady dawn that follows a long and turbulent night. After the confrontation, after the confessions, the wall between us crumbled, leaving us exposed and vulnerable, but finally, standing on the same ground. We spent the rest of that afternoon in his dark apartment, just talking. For the first time, we talked without pretense, without the safety nets of plausible deniability. He told me about the gnawing loneliness that had followed him for years, a feeling he'd tried to outrun by working harder, by traveling more, by being the life of the party. He spoke of his relationship with Sarah not with regret, but with a sad clarity, recognizing it as an attempt to fit into a life he thought he was supposed to want. "I was just following a script," he said, his voice quiet with revelation. "College, girlfriend, career, marriage. I never stopped to ask if I was the right actor for the part." He admitted that his growing dependence on me and my apartment had confused and scared him long before the kiss. He felt a pull towards me that didn't fit into any category he understood. It wasn't brotherly, and it wasn't the way he'd felt about his girlfriends. It was something quieter, deeper, a sense of rightness, of peace, that he only ever felt when he was with me. The kiss had been an impulsive, desperate attempt to give that feeling a name, and the name it gave him had sent his entire world into a tailspin. I listened, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of his own silent struggle. I had been so wrapped up in my own secret, my own longing, that I had seen him as the unknowing initiator, a force of nature acting on instinct. I hadn't fully appreciated that he was on his own journey of discovery, one that was perhaps even more frightening than mine because it challenged the very foundation of his identity. My love for him had been a constant, a known quantity in my own life. His feelings for me were a new and terrifying continent he had just discovered existed. That evening, we didn't go back to my apartment. We stayed at his. We ordered a pizza, and as we ate, a new, tentative normalcy began to take shape. The frantic energy in him was gone, replaced by a quiet calm. He still seemed a little lost, but he was no longer adrift. He had an anchor now, and it was me. Later, as we sat on his uncomfortable couch, he reached for my hand. He just took it, lacing his fingers through mine, and held it in his lap. It was a simple, deliberate act. There was no ambiguity. There was no ritual. It was a statement. This is us now. When it was time to sleep, a moment of quiet, awkward tension fell between us. The guest room in my apartment, his own bed here, they were symbols of the separation we had always maintained. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a plea this time. It was a simple, heartfelt request. We slept in his bed, lying on our sides, facing each other. We didn't do anything more than hold hands, but it was the most intimate experience of my life. In the darkness, I could see his face, his eyes open, watching me. "What are you thinking about?" I whispered. 10 years, he whispered back, his voice full of wonder. "I'm thinking about all the time I wasted being blind." "It wasn't wasted," I said, squeezing his hand. "It was just the long way home." The days that followed were a process of gentle recalibration. We were learning a new language, a new way of being together. The grand, sweeping gestures of romance you see in movies were absent. Our new reality was built on small, quiet moments of domestic intimacy. It was in the way he'd bring me a cup of coffee in the morning, just the way I liked it. It was in the way I'd find myself rubbing the tension from his shoulders as he worked on his laptop at my kitchen table. It was in the simple, profound comfort of falling asleep next to each other, night after night, with no pretense, no fear. The couch ritual, once the source of so much anxiety and hope, transformed. One evening, about a week later, we were at my place, watching a movie. He was sitting beside me, his leg pressed against mine, his hand resting on my thigh. Halfway through the film, he leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder. My body tensed for a split second, a reflex born of months of conditioning, before I relaxed. I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him closer, and kissed the top of his head. He sighed, a sound of pure contentment, and nestled in. It was the same action, the same position, but the meaning was entirely different. It was no longer a question. It was the answer. We had found our new normal. It was quiet, it was gentle, and it was ours. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for so long had finally receded, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of peace. It was the peace of a ship that has finally found its harbor after a long and storm-tossed journey. The world outside hadn't changed. Alex still had his stressful job. I still had my quiet, solitary work. But now, we were facing it together. We were a unit, a team. My photography changed, too. I had always been an observer of quiet moments, of fleeting emotions. But my work had always carried a tinge of melancholy, the perspective of someone on the outside looking in. Now, I found a new warmth creeping into my images. I started a new project, a series of self-portraits of Alex and me. Not posed, formal pictures, but candid shots of our life together. Alex sleeping in a patch of morning sun, our hands clasped on the arm of the couch. His smile, aimed just at me, as I caught him looking at me from across the room. I was no longer just documenting the world. I was documenting my world. Our world. And it was filled with light. Some things, once they are broken, can never be put back together in the same way. Our friendship was one of those things. The kiss had shattered it, breaking the old form beyond repair. But in its place, we began to build something new, something stronger and more honest. It was a structure built not on unspoken rules and careful boundaries, but on shared vulnerability and the terrifying, beautiful courage to say what you feel. We were no longer just friends. We were home. And so we learned that the most profound changes in our lives are not always the loudest. They don't always arrive with the force of a revelation, but sometimes emerge as slowly and as patiently as a photograph in a darkroom. It begins with a latent image, a truth hidden in plain sight, a feeling without a name. And you wait, you watch, and you tend to it with a fragile hope, until one day, you expose it to the light, and you see what was there all along. You see the love that was waiting to be acknowledged, the comfort that was waiting to be accepted. You see the person who was always meant to be your safe harbor. And in the beautiful, honest silence you've learned to create together, you finally begin to heal.